Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and Holly is back again, and she brought me something.
Yes, I was given this loom by somebody that I know, and they got it from somebody else, and I kept it for a while, and I said, I'm not going to learn how to weave fabric as much as I'd like to, so I'm giving it to her.
Yeah, she asked me, and I was like, I really don't need another hobby. And that's what I told her, I think.
Yeah.
And then I thought about it, and I was like, well, if you want, you could send it and I'll mess with it. So she's going to at least hang out long enough to hopefully put this together. And then I'm going to try it, which she probably will not be here for.
Probably not.
Because that's probably going to take a while. So let's see what we see.
Okay.
Oh boy. It looks like it might be partly put together.
I think it was.
Yeah, because if it was used at one point, it was probably put together part way.
Right. We're gonna play the game of where does everything go? And this is why I pulled up the instructions.
So we have the rough idea of what goes where, but we seem to be missing some screws, so I'm going to have to talk to my dad and see if he has the needed screws, and so I guess I will probably be back once it's put together. So we did have the necessary screws to put this together, and I set about trying it out. And while that footage plays, I'm just going to talk about some of my observations using this new loom. But first, a little bit about the actual loom. This is a rigid Heddle loom, which is different from what I'm used to weaving on. When I've done weaving in the past, it's always been on a frame loom, and I never really got any more advanced than that. Now, the rigid Heddle loom has a reed in the middle that you thread your warp threads through. So the warp is the threads that go up and down on your loom. So you thread the warp through the slots and eyes of the reed. And once everything is tied off and you have your tension where it's supposed to be, you can raise or lower the reed, which will raise or lower every other thread to create a shaft that you can pass your weft thread through. And the weft is the yarn that goes side to side on your weaving. The reed also acts as a beater to press down the weft threads as you go. That is a really simplified explanation of how this works. I'm sure there's a lot that I'm missing, but that is all I used, and therefore all that's really relevant for this video. Now, personally, I found warping the new loom to be more difficult than on a frame loom because there were just a lot more steps, because you have to thread the yarn through the openings on the reed and wrap it around a warp peg, and then you have to cut all of those loops and then remove one of those yarns from the slot and put it into the eyes on the reed. So there's just more steps to it compared to a frame loom where you just kind of keep wrapping it back and forth around the pegs on either end of your loom. However, a frame loom is limited on the length of warp that you can use because it's limited by the size of the loom. Whereas with the rigid Heddle loom, and I think most other looms, they have a front bar and a back bar that roll. And so you warp to the length that you want, and then you roll your warp onto that back bar. And then as you weave and you finish your cloth, you roll the finished cloth forward onto the front bar and unroll the warp, more of your warp off of the back bar. Now this is something you can technically kind of rig to do on a frame loom if you have a wooden frame loom, at least certain ones. I've done it before once and it was really difficult, so I would never do that again. So that is a definite advantage, even if it takes longer. So now let's talk about the size. This is a 16-inch wide loom, and it is not the smallest that Ashford sells, nor is it the biggest, and I think the same goes for most other companies that make this type of loom. However, to me, anything beyond a 16-inch would be a bit cumbersome to use without buying a stand to hold it. So there are stands that you can buy for the rigid Heddle looms, and I think if I had anything bigger than a 16-inch, I would want one, because if you don't have a stand, what you do is you rest the back end of the loom against a desk. And like I said, it just seems cumbersome. And another thing with resting it against the desk is there's actually like a cutout on the back end to rest it on the desk. And I noticed that for me, where it is on the back of the loom, I don't like the angle that it sits at. I like to actually take it off the cutout and push the loom up a bit so that it's angled more up. I felt like I could see better that way. It also allowed me then to be closer to the desk doing it that way, so that like I could reach if I had anything sitting on the desk, whether it's scissors, water, whatever, which I didn't feel like I could do as easily if I had it sitting the way the cutout makes it sit. And then another thing on the size is just the storage of it. Obviously, it can come apart because it had obviously been used and then taken apart to fold down. But to me, I'm not going to want to have to put it together. Like if I come up with a project and I have to put it together, chances are I'm just not going to do the project. So I will be leaving it put together and just sticking it under a bed or something, because it's too big to really fit like on a shelf in the closet. Now let's talk about the actual experience with weaving. The first thing I noticed is that this was so much faster than weaving on a frame loom. So the frame loom, you usually have to manually weave in and out, like at least the way I always did it. You would be taking either a needle or your shuttle and looking at all of your warp threads and going, okay, over this one, under that one, over, under, over, under, over, under. That is really slow. Having the reed that raises and lowers the warp threads for you is so much faster that like I did a piece that was longer than anything I've ever done on my frame loom in less time because of being able to raise and lower the warp threads. However, I did notice that because I probably didn't have my tension right on my warp threads, every once in a while I would have one that would be a bit saggy and it would kind of drop when I was supposed to, and I would end up going over it instead of under it like I was supposed to. And it didn't happen often, but because I wasn't having to pay as much attention to what I was doing, because I wasn't having to concentrate on if I was going over or under a thread, I didn't catch it as much as I would had I been doing it, like I guess you could call it manually. Another thing I noticed, I've always struggled with frame looms on pulling my left thread too tight. And what that will do is it will cause the weaving in the middle of your piece to shrink in. So it'll be narrower in the middle and wider on both ends. And from what I saw when I was researching, trying to learn, okay, what am I doing with this thing, is that is a problem regardless of what type of loom you use. It's not like, oh, this is only a problem if you're using a frame loom, use this loom and you won't have to worry about it. And I think because I had that in my mind that I always pull too tight, I went and did it on here and did the complete opposite and left it too loose, because the last, I think it was 3 warp threads on either side of my project were a lot looser and more spread apart than the rest of the warp threads. And I'll show you that when I show you the finished project at the end of this video. I also noticed that with this style of loom, I think there is more of what would be considered loom waste at the end. So basically, you have to leave a certain amount of warp unwoven so that you can tie everything off when you finish. Now, with a frame loom, you can get pretty close to the edge. But with the rigid Heddle Loom, because of that reed that's right there, you're kind of limited because you can only get but so close to the reed. And once all of your warp is unrolled from the back, you have nowhere else to go with it. So I feel like there's maybe a little more waste on that end, but that may actually be a good thing because I have been known with the frame loom to weave as close to the end as I can get, and then I'm trying to take it off and tie knots with like half an inch of yarn left, which is not ideal because it's very hard to tie a knot when it's that small. So it's probably a good thing if you're like me and you have a tendency to push how close you can get to the end of the weaving. So here is the finished project. And let's see, the things I mentioned throughout the video. Here is the edges where you can see, like, do you see that? How wide it is up here between the white warp threads and how much tighter it is down here. So I don't know what caused that, but I mean, I suppose in a way I do prefer that over pulling it so tight that I end up with uneven fabric. So, and then the skipped stitches are, let's see, like there's one right there, and there's one right there where it's like, you see how the blue is going over 2 or 3 of the white ones instead of over under. But it's not that noticeable. I would consider it, you know, just adding character to the piece. I mean, overall, I am very happy with how this turned out, and I will definitely be doing some more research and seeing what else I can do with this loom. But that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.